where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see.
A big, powerful America, and shoot them for what?
On that continent, we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other.
I want you to imagine that you're running for president in your country. And in the middle of campaigning and preparation for the election, you receive a call. This call is coming from a U.S. official. And this official wants to let you know that, unfortunately, you're not likely to win, but the United States will help you in various ways and financially contribute to your campaign. And this is as long as you don't enter into an agreement that's currently active with your neighboring countries. And this agreement is popular with the people, and it's actually an agreement that would likely help you and your country get out of debt. So today we'll be discussing Wikileaks and the Renaissance, and we're going to be reading Wikileaks files, and that's by we're going to be referencing Wikileaks files by various authors. Many of us, I would say, know Wikileaks, and we know it through it as being a source for government information that's really been kept secret from the public. And I think most of us would have a general understanding that Wikileaks is an embarrassment to the establishment in various ways. But the problem here is that the general public doesn't really have a solid grasp on exactly what's contained in Wikileaks. And this is something that I think we should work on as a population, right? Particularly content creators, but also just in general understanding and starting to dive into what Wikileaks really does provide. And for those that don't know, it's really just it's a series of communications between officials, right? So this is between United States officials, but also between officials in the United States and other countries, or people who are going to be into politics in some way, shape, or form. And this is not. There are a lot of documents, or a lot of files and pages of these particular communications, and many of which have not been summarized appropriately, right? Because what's funny is you'll read these documents and you won't really think much of it, right? Because it won't mean anything without the actual context. And that's what's going to be really important for content creators, I think, in general, but also when it comes down to the idea of what we understanding and unpacking this idea of what's wrong with society right now and what needs to be fixed. The Renaissance, I would say, is the repair of society. And this is in uncovering and really understanding what's here. It helps us gain grounding for where we want to go, because it gives us a further and a more in-depth understanding of where we're at now. And when it comes down to Julian Assange, and this is the publisher for, or the head publisher for WikiLeaks, right? And this particular situation, for those that don't know, Julian Assange was quite frankly illegally detained and illegally. I'm not sure if prosecuted is the right word, but he was detained for quite a long time, and he was released recently after pleading guilty to a certain number of to certain crimes, and essentially it can be said that he pleaded guilty to doing journalism. For those that don't know, Daniel. First off, there's a myth going around now that there's an understanding that is trying to populate the media that the WikiLeaks led to our soldiers or agents abroad being in danger or being harmed in any way, and they weren't. Nobody was harmed due to the release of WikiLeaks. And I personally believe that there are people who have published that need to be firmly reminded of the fact that they are publishing quote-unquote misinformation. And that is very much something that I'm very, very disgusted about when it comes down to our media, because in the actual court case, they had to essentially issue an apology to Julian Assange, and I think this was a backdoor, more of a backroom thing, but they had to issue an apology. They had to apologize for claiming that his documents led to physical harm of anyone abroad, and it did not. And this idea of I'll say pleading guilty, for those that don't know, the Pentagon Papers, there's also an episode on that. Please check that out. But also the idea of what happens with WikiLeaks, what's happened with Julian Assange, and what's happened with Daniel Ellsberg and Pentagon Papers, and for those that don't know, the Pentagon Papers were essentially just a review, an in-depth review and an honest opinion of what was happening and how to move forward in the Vietnam War. Daniel Ellsberg worked in the actual White House. He was also worked for a consultant agency for the White House, and this idea of going after Daniel Ellsberg fell flat. And why that is so, why people should be really, really worried, because Daniel Ellsberg was the whistleblower. Julian Assange was the publisher. That right there, in terms of where we've gone with society as a whole, it is tremendous. There's a tremendous difference. There is no reason to think that publishing, or there was no reason for. There were papers who refused to publish, right, in order to keep up some kind of relationship, right, to keep their press credentials or whatever, right. There were in Daniel Ellsberg's case, where the Pentagon Papers, where he was trying to fish around with the Pentagon Papers, and there was very real, people flat out. There were still mainstream outlets that decided to go ahead with it, right? And this is huge, because these guys were able to do that. without any repercussion, because it was freedom of speech to publish. Now, in terms of the whistleblower, how those documents were obtained, that is the only particular realm of legal blowback. That was it. And to see Julian Assange in prison for, and essentially, and the idea of being physically held, and Julian Assange isn't even American. He's from Australia. But for some reason, this was illegal by, to even bring Julian Assange and try to have him brought to the United States, to be brought in front of our judge, as if there is some semblance of jurisdiction that this judge has over what Julian Assange was able to publish. And it's dark. It's very dark. In that message, people are happy with Julian Assange being released. It's no longer a big deal, right? I'm in a Free Assange group, Free Assange Denver, I think, or Free Assange Colorado. And there was someone in the group was saying that, okay, he's been released, it's not really as big of an issue. And this isn't the case, because that was a message. Him pleading guilty was a message for journalism and the future of journalism as a whole, because now the whistleblower was already, we've already, please look at whistleblowers in the Renaissance as well. We've already established the idea of whistleblowers kind of getting less and less room to really tell the public about the wrongdoings of particular entities or agencies. But this is going to have publishers everywhere with audiences looking at whistleblowers like in a completely new light now, because now they are on the hook, and that precedence has been set. And this is dangerous for the future of journalism. This is dangerous for people for people who want to see real change in any way, shape, or form. And it's important. It's important because this is to have this president exist in the way it does is a very, very serious issue in terms of the dark turn that we've taken to go after a journalist is certainly something that we should be wary of and actively pursue real justice, not simply the release of Julian Assange, the absolute blanket pardon, right? Because the idea for Daniel Ellsberg was the government was involved in a crime, and this crime was exposed, so we're going to pardon these particular suits that are being brought against Daniel in his case. And this is in terms of WikiLeaks in general. I went to WikiLeaks, the page, and it's been shut down since the arrest of Julian Assange. And that's very worrisome. That's very worrisome because the precedence has been established for these guys, for this team, for the WikiLeaks team, and it's something that we need to continue to push for. The revival of WikiLeaks is now kind of a goalpost for how we understand and how we can move along into a real Renaissance age. Now, for this idea of living in an age where publishers aren't safe, we do want to establish a kind of pressure for this particular administration, for what's going on now in terms of with government, to have them understand that the people do have a very clear idea of what that means, what it means for this to not be allowed in the message that it's been sent. And now we talked a little bit about how WikiLeaks is communications between government officials, both both nationally and internationally, right? And when it comes down to the introduction, there are cases, I believe it is, I want to say, what we interfere everywhere, first off, but there are situations, and we'll talk about the introduction later. I have that written down later. I do want to put this out there in terms of establishing WikiLeaks and what happened there. One thing that stuck out was the idea of government officials and how they responded to WikiLeaks. They took WikiLeaks and they said, "Hey, this is something." It was a lot of different ways they responded. I'm sorry, but one of the main ways I think was really most impactful in terms of the statement that it really brought about was, I'm going to there schools everywhere, colleges everywhere, they sent out a message to say basically, hey, we don't talk about WikiLeaks, and if you do, it needs to be understood that maybe this government information would be maybe too sensitive for you because you can't respect what happens in the government. And there was it's the way they threw around their weight, of course. I mean, a lot of our institutions, they receive a lot of benefits from our government that probably would extend into financial, but also just the idea of the revolving door between institutions and the government in general. That was insane. That was insane to think that this is how our government would respond, to throw around its weight to simply stop that, the people who are quote unquote on the intellectuals, who want to use their mind to change the world, and how to set that precedence of, hey, this is no longer this is not a source of information that we want you guys involved in, even though this is very much involved with changing the world in terms of stating how the world really operates right now. Not allowing, and the way in which that response was dished out was unfavorable, to put it mildly. And I I would say that needs to be put on its I would like to see that put on its head, to where any student studying politics or any student studying what happens in politics, they need to have, particularly, like, I would like to see something like a WikiLeaks course, right? To where literally literally unpacking WikiLeaks, literally making content for WikiLeaks. It can be various things, but I think that would be very beneficial for how to move or for the new generation in terms of how they could move forward. That would be extremely beneficial in one way, shape, or form in terms of what we do and how we educate our particular populace in any way, shape, or form. Even high school classes, this is something that I would really like to see, in terms of, I'm thinking about, particular courses where there's people going through the actual documents and formulating actual pieces of content based on their research and the documents and what's being said, and that being either published online based on the actual professor, or actually to where the professor has to quote unquote fact check. But I really like the idea of checking resources rather than using the word fact check, and seeing that and creating and putting it out there more and more and more. I think that'd be very powerful. Now, I got so many tangents for this one. I think I hope I just spent out the tangents that I had in the beginning, but if I do go off on a tangent, please forgive me. But this idea of getting exposure to what's going on or what's in the WikiLeaks is going to come down to content creators, I think, and how they can translate this particular information and their willingness to translate this information. And I can think of no one more willing to translate this information than the people who are in colleges in any way, shape, or form. This idea of overreach by the government. This idea of overreach by the government. The idea here is, I think what was interesting was the definition of really defining the quote unquote empire. Now it's been really deduced to the idea of the communication method itself, right? So control over what the actual communication is, control over that communication method is very much that quote. At first it confused me, but in really looking further and looking and understanding a little bit more down the line, it's very much something that I think we need to understand, because the idea of controlling the communication method itself, the Telegram CEO was criminalized essentially for allowing encryption, right? So this particular method, this idea of allowing for encryption was in some way, shape, or form related to some nefarious acts, and that was somehow laid on the feet of the Telegram CEO. And This is insane because, I mean, you're not going to, if Facebook, if Facebook is used for nefarious means, you're not going to go after Mark Zuckerberg. But this is, it's ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous, and it's complete overreach. And it would seem that this idea of platforms that allow for encryption are violating the empire in a very real way. And this is crazy because just recently, I want to say the late last year or the beginning of this year, but there was some kind of hack to where, and I think this advisory is still kind of floating about, even though it's not public information. They're saying, hey, don't send messages through, SMS or the standard messaging protocol on your phone, because China has infiltrated some kind of communication system, and this is very. I believe that they actually asked us to use encrypted messaging or other messaging app. I'm not sure exactly what. It could have been other messaging apps, but it was just like it was such. I mean, I'm almost smacking myself and palming myself in the face right now. I'm just like, is this serious? Are you serious right now? This is really what you're doing? And it's like when China does it, hey, it's a problem, but when we do it, like it's absolutely insane. In terms of our government responding to this particular idea of WikiLeaks too, it is so pity. It is pitiful, but I think it's like it's such a this idea of WikiLeaks. They created a tag system, right? And they used the tag system to say that, to basically make sure that this is filtered into the spam email if it has the words WikiLeaks or WikiLeaks in the actual message. And of course, a lot of people were telling them like, hey, look, you can't do that. I mean, there's important communications that may have, for some reason, WikiLeaks, and it was a genuine a genuine problem, I'll say, in terms of for communicating with the government. But it was, in terms of this idea of them responding and how they responded, it was so enlightening to see that, right? To see what how the government responded, right? So locking up Julian Assange was the most worrisome, but of course, responding in a way, the idea of throwing your weight around to schools to prevent them from sourcing this idea of what's happening in the government and turning that into actual content is very much, it's not a distant second, I would say. I think it's very much something that we should also be aware about when it comes down to these institutions and how we look at them, because a lot of them are linked to the government. A lot of them do receive benefits from the government. And this is obviously, this is an obvious abuse of power by the government to do that. And we shouldn't, like I said, we shouldn't view this as a distant second. And this right here was, it's like a, it's like a ex just going crazy after the breakup, like, what do you, like, you're just gonna filter all my messages to spam? Like, what? Are you serious? It's pretty insane. Or any messages with my name to spam or something like that. Like, it is so. It's very telling to see that, because it really lets you know where we're at. And also, businesses were told it was businesses were told it was a danger. So, like, this idea of WikiLeaks, it was painted as dangerous in various ways. And one thing WikiLeaks did was they exposed how companies who were, like, illegally dumping waste into a river, they exposed what was happening and the idea itself. And governments in London, the courts decided that it was legal to hide what was done or censor the information. That's very surprising from London or England in many ways, because it's just like how, when you see the media in London and in England, you think, okay, well, they're better in a lot of different ways, and they're not as corrupt as us yet, like, and that's very much, it's very much seen in a lot of things that the media will still be willing to take on and tackle. But that was definitely it's definitely a strike against England and London in general, in terms of how that government operates. And at one point in the book, torture is discussed, and this is interesting, because this is really just one of the authors that was, I believe he was responsible for, how I want to say one of the war zones in the Middle East. I'm not sure exactly which one, but this idea of torture and what happened, or how we define torture, this is defined by the country with the most power, right, and the most influence. They define torture, and that was very, very interesting to see that, because there was literally a pamphlet released of simply just monstrous things that could be done but not considered torture, because they were in that pamphlet, essentially. I couldn't imagine, like, having to graphically organize or just organize any type of information regarding that, the idea of trying to essentially say this isn't torture. And just, I'm like, how does one go to bed that night after printing that and giving that to anybody is beyond me. And it's honest insanity to think that, but it's the way that legally how these countries were able to do what they did in a lot of different situations. This idea of torture in a lot of situations, I'm not gonna, like, I don't care what's in the pamphlet. It's like, torture is, like, we pretty much have a solid understanding about what's torture, what's not torture. I'm not going to use the idea of what's in this pamphlet to delineate between torture and coercing a suspect. You know what? I don't know what kind of legal implications that could or legal exploits that kind of open me up to. So I'm gonna say, really, this idea of coercing a suspect. This is interesting, because This idea in general, in terms of the result from that, it does not. There is not much to say that it yields results, and in a lot of cases, you simply turn people into just more. You just make you make these people somewhat skeptical, right? So the idea of, for instance, sanctions, with sanctions in the Renaissance, please look at that too. The idea of sanctions in the Renaissance. What happens when a country feels bitter and turns bitter from the sanctions that are imposed upon them is something that, for instance, might have very well led to Pearl Harbor and World War II in general, right? Because we made some demands that may have not been looked at as that may have been looked at as more punitive rather than actually trying to repair and help repair a society and help make amends for what was done. I think we need to be careful with that, because this idea of torture or coercing a suspect, it led to unreasonable confessions in a lot of cases. And this is very much somebody. I remember in Guantanamo, out of the Guantanamo Bay letters, and I believe that's still on my channel. Look at that as well. The idea of the Guantanamo Bay letters and what's happened. There were a lot of farmers in Guantanamo Bay. There were people who simply just confessed to blanket whatever you put in front of my face. I'm gonna say I did it. If that means that the waterboarding stops, or a lot of different punishment does come to an end. And that's what we do. I think we look like clowns to a lot of these people. And I think internationally we look like clowns. And I think we really were that, because that was those people who perform those acts. I don't care what kind of suit you were wearing, you were performing a very dishonorable deed to these people. And for some reason, like, you could, I don't care how many medals that this government decides to give you, it was not in any way, shape, or form an honorable deed that you've done, and then something that benefited your country. I just went off on another tangent, didn't I? Okay, so the idea of confessions there was very much something that we want to, move into, right? What's most impactful in terms of getting what we want out of people, and this is clearly like this. There's been tremendous arguments. I won't say it's clearly not it, even though I would say, there's not very many reasons to believe that this is it, apparently, but we do want to be careful about how we can do that in the future. The communications on the Wikileaks are called the cables, right? So these idea of cables, the cables released. There's a chapter there's a chapter for a lot of different places and countries, but particularly in the Middle East, corrupt leaders were exposed, right? And the U.S. has tons of interest in the Middle East, and they've dedicated a lot of different missions into destabilizing countries and influencing politics in the Middle East. There have been people. There was mention of the government in Egypt and coercing them not to accept Palestinian refugees, and a lot of that is, I mean, it's crazy because now if you look at now to like 2025 February 14th, we're talking. We have the current administration talking about going in and essentially finding another place for Palestinians in the Middle East after doing this is, I mean, this, it's just, it's something because it's insanity and it is quote unquote legalized or it's insanity by the people who define what is legal and what is not. And that's scary because knowing the interest behind a lot of this stuff, which, I mean, if you didn't know, essentially our politicians abroad internationally, they're just salesmen. They'll sit there salesmen for the weapons industry. They're salesmen for different types of, for instance, like Boeing was mentioned. This idea of what's going on abroad and what our politicians really do abroad. Monsanto was another monstrous piece or monstrous company, they just were up to just ignorance abroad, and they went out and claimed that countries that accepted Monsanto were more technologically advanced. When it comes down to what our politicians do, they get dressed up in these fancy suits and they play salesmen to a lot of these guys internationally, and a lot of them, they simply don't have shame, they don't have honor, and that is, I mean, to be frank, it's just disgusting. And like, I'm gonna keep finding myself in these tangents, but the idea was they remain active and they, being the government, remains active to essentially gain control of the Muslim world, and that could easily be seen today, of course, with what's happening in Israel and Palestine. But it's a project that is extending way back to various administrations, and we should definitely understand this is more than just one event. The U.S. also backed the Papadoc regime in Haiti, which, for those that haven't watched it, Haiti and please watch Haiti in the Renaissance or check that out. That is, I mean, when it came down to Papadoc and the element of U.S. backing Papadoc, that was, I mean, there was such an element of overreaching government surveillance in Haiti that I believe went beyond the technological. It went very much into the spiritual, in terms of how people police themselves. And that is something that it's scary. It's scary to know that, right? And a lot of these guys, they were mentioned in the Middle East as well, where essentially, like, they were backing regimes to take over who would promise access to oil. And these weren't popular people, right? So they were like, I imagine, various AstroTurf Corp campaigns to get these people, to make these people appear popular, right? So AstroTurf campaigns is just essentially pretending that something is popular by paying a lot of people to show support in a lot of different ways in a lot of different areas. And it's, I mean, I imagine something like that was done in a lot of different cases, especially with our quote-unquote war on terror. And this is interesting because the war on terror, it started in it started in Afghanistan but moved out to Iraq. And Iraq was the primary objective. Moving out to Iraq it was mentioned that this was more of the primary objective. I'm not sure exactly why, but I do remember thinking that those two countries, though there was no real barrier between those in terms of how I viewed them with this war. And that was interesting because Iraq had nothing to do with what happened, and there was no reason to believe that they had anything to do with what happened. But the war spread into Iraq, and it's how things turned out. It's how things were very much carried out on the field, right? So we did not respect that idea, right? So we put these borders and these lines up to have some semblance of, oh, this is how it works, and we did not follow that abroad. And that was very much, that was very much something, because in my mind I meshed those two together, and I think a lot of us did. I think a lot of people did. And we said, oh, it's just one mesh up. And that idea is, I think it's rooted into the idea, like the campaign to say that these people aren't really a part of this civilization that we brought about, right? And that's kind of key, that's kind of key in terms of turning this into, or crossing a very real border on our maps to go into, and that they follow, to go into and essentially attack various countries. Very much we should worry about that in terms of how we're, after this right here, I did not start this endeavor of really, trying to become more solidified in my understanding of corruption and, the idea of defining corruption. I did not start this with a favorable opinion of the United States, of course, right? So I would consider myself a healing conspiracy theorist in a lot of ways. And some of this stuff isn't helping. like WikiLeaks did not help in the least bit, I would say, in terms of healing. It just really, really, if you're trying to be more hopeful about this idea, the state that we're in, maybe not read the WikiLeaks, because maybe you can just hold on to that, the myth that we've created for ourselves in a lot of different ways, or, the semblance of respect that you have for the politicians in the suits, because I'll be honest, it's ridiculous. I'm not gonna stop with these tangents. I'm just not. Absolutely not. This idea of Venezuela, right? So at some point they go into a chapter on Venezuela, and this is actually connected to the introduction, right? So the agreement was something. The agreement for the introduction story was something that originated in Venezuela. The idea of what these countries were able to essentially just take out and carry on with, because they were able to do this in such a hostile environment, right? Because there's an agreement, I think it's called the Paracaribe. Basically, where Southern America has this this agreement amongst countries that's essentially an oil agreement, right? So agreement to what happens with the oil, and they have this agreement, and it is tremendous for the countries involved. And this idea of Venezuela, we were trying to, like, I remember, like, Venezuela was like, of course, when it comes down to oil, we're gonna we're gonna try our darnest to make sure that it ends up in the hands of like Exxon or whoever, whatever plays Exxon or Chevron and those monsters. But like in terms of Venezuela and what they were able to do, this idea of the Paracaribe, they created a network of countries, right? And this particular leader created a network of countries, and it was really originated in kind of creating this, or central to this whole agreement. And I forget his name. Give me 1 second. I'm actually gonna look this guy up because it's worth it. Hugo Chavez. That's his name. And Hugo Chavez, he was central to this whole agreement, and it happened, in Venezuela, of course, was central to this agreement. He was leading Venezuela, and we tried to overthrow him in various ways, and we couldn't. Or I say we, but it's the government. The government couldn't do it. They our government couldn't overthrow him, and he ended up creating this network and essentially opposing the U.S. empire in this way, and helping countries abroad rather than holding them to the slavery what's essentially slavery. And please check out World Bank and the IMF and the Renaissance as well, if you want to know more about what we do abroad and how we act abroad, or how we've the modern day what's essentially modern day colonialism in a lot of different ways. But Venezuela, they opposed the U.S. and they successfully thwarted coup attempts and things like that. And I think it was very, very. Hugo Chavez I think that's tremendous in terms of what Hugo was able to do, or Mr. Chavez was able to do, and that was something that I think he deserves a tremendous amount of respect for. And this idea of Europe and other countries, there were agreements, right? International contracts that Europe and other countries tried to essentially hold the U.S. to, or just essentially try to, this is something that seems instrumental to the idea of the UN, right? And the U.S. never agreed, and they backed down. And not only did they not agree with this whole quote-unquote war on terror, right? We, as citizens, it was painted as, hey, do nothing or go to war, right? That was our options, or that was the options presented to the general populace. In this international agreement, there would have been an understanding that we need to handle this in the best way possible. We do not want these quote-unquote terrorists going in and attacking the United States, but this is something that needs to be handled. And we were what is it called? We went to politics by other means. We dispatched of the civility and decided that it was now war. And we stomped on that agreement that these guys tried to make for everyone, this international conflict agreement. And it's interesting because Europe and, the EU was trying to get involved, and we stomped on the EU in a lot of ways for this this quote unquote war on terror. We did not. There's very likely still a bad taste in everybody's mouth from what we did abroad, and that was something that essentially, when it comes down to this idea of holding the U.S. accountable on an international platform, we don't agree, right? We don't agree because we view ourselves as, it would seem, this is how it seems, is that we view ourselves as better than everybody else, including the EU, right? This is interesting because this is also played out in another way, because the EU just flat out denied Monsanto, right? So for those that don't know, Monsanto wants to essentially just spray your crops with poison and give you genetically modified food, and it's ridiculous. It's honestly ridiculous. And our politicians put on their best salesman face and did what they could to manipulate and try and infiltrate the EU. And they have, in a lot of different ways. They were successful in a lot of different ways, and we were bullish about that. But the EU flatly rejected Monsanto. And the countries that were about to be in the EU, they agreed to Monsanto because of some kind of some kind of incentive that the United States provided. It was it was ridiculous. But this idea of our politicians abroad, that was the view of some kind of international diplomacy, policy, things like that, needs to be looked at with such a tremendous, it's such a tremendous detail in terms of how and why we are where we are and what we do. That this is because we are completely we are out of line in so many different ways. This idea of, for instance, there's an instance where there is a conflict brewing between Israel and Israel and Iran, and essentially that conflict, we said that tension, abroad, we were saying, hey, look, that tension could turn nuclear if you buy our weapons, if you buy our particular nuclear weapons or whatever. Then maybe that would help desensitize what's going on and the tensions brewing. And we use that to countries that weren't in the conflict but would definitely feel, the reverberations if there was a nuclear conflict. And it was that right there was, essentially we just wanted more customers for Boeing or more customers for whatever contractors that are involved in nuclear weapons. Now, Russia is one of our competitors abroad, right? For of course. And this makes sense, for anybody, and that the idea of Russia being involved in what goes on. Uh, they don't. There is a competition apparently between who can provide or who can provide. I won't say just nuclear weapons, but just weaponry abroad. Period. And there is, like I said, we have very real salesmen on the job for a lot of our weapons companies. But when it comes down to the idea of really Russia in general, there is this idea of banning nuclear weapons, the use of nuclear weapons in particular. There was, there's a chapter that goes into how this is not necessarily interpreted the same way by everyone, right? And the idea of this particular contract and what could take place outside of this contract. There is a lot of talk about how this may lead to the further development of non-nuclear weapons. And I mean, like, we are so dedicated to we're dedicated to contending, to being a solid contender in this race for the suicide of the human race. But I mean, in general, this is we have to understand that maybe this particular language for the actual development of nuclear weapons is something that we should look at more carefully, all right? Because the banning of nuclear weapons is easy, but maybe going into how much damage or how big of an explosion can be. I'm trying. I feel like this, but capping the idea of maybe bombs shouldn't be more than a kiloton, and we need to make sure that that's a thing, like maybe, or kiloton in terms of the actual the damage. And I'm not sure why that's in weight. I think that's more of an actual nuclear, that's more of a nuclear terminology. But the idea of controlling the size of allowable explosions, period, needs to maybe be a cap rather than just the ban of, let's say, nuclear weapons, right? Because we're thinking of all types of crazy things out there. We got some mad scientists that are well funded, given how insane our current our current government is as a whole, regardless of administration. Now, this idea of the government and how we talk to our idea of what's happening abroad, in particular in Russia, we're building bases, I mean, essentially just all around Russia, or just outside of Russian territory, right? So we're, for those that don't know, the idea of launching a nuclear weapon from, Omaha, it may not be able to reach Russia, but having particular bases around Russia kind of puts tactically that could, these bases would make a lot more sense if you were going to attack Russia. And it was, we put these bases up, and we gave them like, oh, we're just worried about Iran or something like that. But essentially it was just like, oh, I'm not like I don't even know how you'd have to treat someone to tell them that spit on your face isn't rain, or it's just rain. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's insane. And it's hard not when we really look at what goes on. It's hard not to really just think of the U.S. government as just an international terrorist group. It's dark, but it's something that a lot of us need to come to terms with if we're going to really repair anything. Now, this idea of weapons of mass destruction in general, of course, it was a tremendous influence for us in us going to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, apparently, but this is actually pretty popular, right? So there's people want to simply say that and claim that when they want the U.S. to invade, particularly Israel, right? So Israel wanted to say, oh, they have weapons of mass destruction in Iran, and there's, I mean, it's they. It doesn't appear that they had proof. Like there was no real evidence. They just said that, and they wanted to say that, and it was. I mean, we just want to throw that out there. When you hear weapons of mass destruction, I mean, what other interest do we have in this place? I think that warrants a real investigation in terms of having an understanding of how that happens, or why we would do that, and why maybe somebody would claim the idea of weapons of mass destruction in any other place. This in terms of particularly Israel, we have, I mean, they actually use WikiLeaks for its own purpose, which is, I mean, essentially just they were trying to paint the picture that there wasn't harmony in the Middle East, and that was to help their case, right? And the idea is harmony amongst these countries in the Middle East, and trying to essentially help the idea and the process of destabilizing the Middle East. And it used WikiLeaks, but it refuted, or it apparently it just either ignored or refuted a lot of what was said in the process, right? Because when it came down to Israel, there were reports that called out the humanitarian crisis between, what's been going on in Palestine, and that release and that idea of humanitarian groups and reports coming out about what's going on and what's happening there. That was essentially just almost shadow banned, I would say, in terms of the idea of creating more awareness around the situation there. In terms of Israel, there's an interesting case where, and a foreign diplomat goes into Palestine to, I guess, meet with leaders, and we fired the official, we fired the foreign diplomat for essentially going in and recognizing Palestine. And that, I mean, of course, when you think about the power that Israel has in the U.S., it's unprecedented. But I think it's something. It's definitely something to this particular idea of what they're able to get away with and what they're trying to do with that particular power and influence. And for those that don't know, Israel, like we have this international agreement between, to kind of be more transparent about, or about the idea of nuclear weapons, what happens with how we handle nuclear weapons and things of that nature. Israel is clownish in the way. I'm not gonna say they're clownish. I'm gonna say they treat everyone else as like clowns. It's in terms of, we don't have nuclear. We don't have nuclear weapons. We don't even what? It's like I just picture like you hear gunshots across like from behind the building, and you go behind the check like what's going on here? It's like, and they're just looking at you like, what? I didn't hear anything. Like, it's like, what? Like, okay, like, this is crazy. But in terms of, when it comes down to nuclear conflict in general, how Israel views itself versus the surrounding countries, that's a very real worry that has probably the most potential to keep me up at night in terms of what could happen there. And essentially what they're able to get away with, and in terms of with the U.S. and that and how the U.S. denies the idea of being internationally accountable for crimes is tremendous. There is tremendous room for non-civil behavior. And Turkey comes into this conversation. I admittedly don't know or haven't heard much about Turkey, but the U.S. per se considers Turkey a threat because it can essentially join Iran in going against Israel, right? And in terms of the Turkey, it gives, it kind of gives us a window into the economics of the Middle East, right? And with Turkey in general, there is also there's a particular figure, right, Gulen, and this is a man who's developing schools, and he may end up being a revolutionary force and in Turkey in a lot of different ways. Haven't quite made up my mind about what goes on there, but that is interesting that he's primary revolutionary force through how he educates people, and this idea of being an educator of people. Very, very interesting there. Now, we also have this chapter on Syria, right? And apparently, the Syria, like this idea of the U.S., right? The U.S. was actually motivated to essentially disconnect, or to essentially just use whatever tools they could to play political football, and essentially create more favorable conditions in the leadership, we'll say, right? And this idea of officials and how we played football they don't really have, there aren't too many foreign officials who could say that they lacked understanding of the potential for destabilization. And this idea of what's happened in Syria, for those that don't know, there was essentially a civil war, and there was a very large scale, I'm not sure about the state of Syria today, but there's a large scale destruction and destabilization of Syria. and we had a we had our hand in that. We had our hand in that in a lot of in a few different ways, and I want to say we backed up, some kind of like, a more radical leader and something, whether it be through AstroTurf campaigns or whatever. But we definitely have, we have a lot, we have a lot of Syrian blood on our hands, as well as various other peoples across the world. Now, the idea of Iraq in particular, our government backed who promised us access to oil, and they were not. These were people who were, just people who are, when it comes down to a humanitarian level, these people were despicable, right? And it was a lot of they did not have a lot of support, but we backed them because it got us oil, and that is, it's crazy because it's crazy. There were also situations to where the government was allowed to torture people in prison cells. And this is just regular police prison cells, and they're being tortured. And this idea of Iraq and how we left Iraq, we left it in ridiculous conditions after this, and we chose to destroy that country based on backing people who were willing to give us oil. That's, like I said, you're not gonna like read this book and leave with a more favorable opinion of what we, who we are abroad and who we are on the world stage. Now, moving across the country, I think is that. I think we look at Japan, right? And one thing crazy, we also tried to force feed them Monsanto, and they refused. And that's just one thing that happened in Japan, but that's also very interesting and more more understanding of us abroad in terms of our foreign diplomats really being, or our politicians just being salespersons abroad, and I think a lot of it is clownish, and I think we should look at a lot of people as particularly clowns, and it's crazy because I would say not everyone now, right? Because I think there is, and that's kind of in this uncovering that's happening now, and this being more precise about this glob of whatever being corrupt, this glob of government being corrupt, and being more precise about what happens, I think is very helpful. And but in terms of this idea, going back to Japan, we had for those that don't know, we have an agreement, right? So we're the military for Japan, and they've grown economically, and they've benefited economically from this relationship, right? So in a lot of time, and they make sure to essentially just really, really stay peaceful in a lot of different ways. More recently, that's kind of up for debate, with the tensions kind of brewing in the world today, and it's definitely something I'm looking at, or I'm kind of like really worried about in terms of Japan. For those that don't know, for those that don't know, which shouldn't be anybody, but we dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, and when I say we, I mean our government. That is, I think, what's the tension today. I always want to say I've seen a documentary to where we've essentially Japan may become more militant and may go into a more may become more militant in how they handle a lot of things. And for someone who's essentially been, when you have a group of people that have experienced a nuclear bomb, the way in which they become militant, I think is that could easily left a taste in their mouth, and I think we should be aware of that because and be careful about that, because the way in which they get up may not be in the favor of America in general. But in terms of this particular movement, what was interesting about this is that we wanted to essentially convince them to pay to move our bases to another location to where we'd have more power in parts of Asia, and we wanted them to pay for it. And we were trying to throw our weight around or whatever, and we were simply trying to get essentially them to become more self-sustainable military-wise, and that could have essentially led to that could have easily led to the situation that I'm thinking about now. And in terms of this particular, how Japan responds now, I think we could very much see that, we could see that becoming an issue in terms of how we wanted to essentially move our bases, which would essentially be less immediate protection for Japan, but kind of trying to influence a more militant government or a more militarily able and capable government in Japan. That could have some consequences, some very real consequences down the line that I'm really, like I said, I'm looking at. But that is in Japan. That's what it is, right? So in terms of Korea, right? So a lot of us know that we kind of have an understanding. South Korea, they're the good guys. North Korea, they're the bad guys, right? If you're looking at things kind of from a very ridiculous standpoint, right? Or what I'm coming to understand is a ridiculous standpoint, because South Korea, apparently they wanted to make peace with North Korea, right? And they wanted to do this through a series of projects or whatever, and I forget exactly how, but they decided, or the U.S. stopped it, right? So they influenced South Korea to stop the projects that would essentially make more peace between North and South Korea. For those that don't know, North Korea has nuclear weapons. North Korea would use those nuclear weapons, and North Korea is probably, when it comes down to the agreement for nuclear weapons, they are the most out and like, I'm worried about Israel because of what they don't say. I'm worried about North Korea because of what they do say. It's like kind of like that guy in the corner with the pistol. He's fidgeting, he's shaking, and he's pointing at everybody, and he's just like, don't give me a reason to use it. If we can sum up those words, that's exactly what it is with North Korea. And we don't. I mean, we've created this situation to where they've decided to isolate themselves, and it's like I said. I mean, it's something. It's definitely something. But we do have our. I mean, we have our foot on the scale in terms of making sure that I mean that essentially just keeping them isolated, keeping them more isolated. Um, now, now for this was surprising for me in general, but we have a lot of, in terms of the Philippines for Southeast Asia, the Philippines in particular it's kind of viewed as a landing pad for the United States and Southeast Asia, and we had a lot of and we've been trying to throw weight around there as well. I don't have any details laid out here, but apparently we have like a tremendous amount of this tremendous amount of understanding between us and Philippines in terms of how their government goes and things like that, and how we'll influence their government if need be to be that landing pad for us into Southeast Asia. Now, another thing I think is interesting is our recession led to China increasing its influence with neighbors, right? And are kind of gaining more internet, or more of an international platform. So that's very interesting when you look at today, of course, and what happens today, or what we're going through right now, and what it could lead to. Because apparently this, the idea of trading with China and things of that nature it could have been more appealing for a long time now, and knowing about the roots that could have been set up through those particular relationships. It's definitely something. Now, going into Africa, there is, Nixon secretly supported apartheid regimes in Africa. For those that don't know, this is idea of South Africa had apartheid regime, and all, but it's not the only one that had the apartheid regime, right? This idea of how Nixon and America viewed Africa, that's very, very, very telling in terms of the idea of our government versus China and what China does. For those that don't know, China is also interested in Africa. They're going in, and they're going in certain parts of Africa, and they're doing certain things, and they're not making humanitarian issues their front line, but they're not actively opposed to that as a lot of the influence that we try to put on Africa is. And I think that's when you do have that black and white issue, I think or not black and white, but when you have those issues, it can easily fall into the favor of China, and what happens with China. This, and it's just it's just disgusting how Nixon talked about other countries, of course, but Africa, of course, being the worst of it in terms of the idea of these administrations being, or America being, racist in a lot of ways. It definitely showed. Now, the U.S. also with the Paracaribe, right? With going back to the Venezuela thing, they wanted to use the World Bank and foreign aid, and they wanted to throw around that idea, right, to develop and influence what happens in South America specifically, and trying to use that specifically to oppose, to oppose the new oil agreement that South America has been, been putting out there, and it failed in a lot of different ways. I'm not sure about the state of Paracaribe today, but definitely fell flat for at least for some time. And I mean, I think we're kind of showing our hands on a lot of this stuff, because it's just like showing ourselves to be exactly what it seems like, abroad, in terms of us just being international terrorists abroad, and how we act abroad and what we do abroad in a lot of different situations. And it's easy to see that a lot of us, I don't think it's all bad, but it's definitely got bad attached to it. Now, this idea of influencing other countries, and I think there was a particular situation in South America where they sent an official to investigate a human crisis during an election, and the idea they were trying to essentially put it in the minds of the people that, oh, this is a humanitarian crisis that we're investigating under the current administration, and that was. It's interesting to see us use that as a political, turn that into a way to influence people politically. I mean, we're there. How much incentive does our government have to send that humanitarian crisis to Palestine? We it's clownish. It's very clownish. And like I said, Venezuela, I think, is it's interesting because of what they were able to do, and how they were able to really go about and go against the U.S. and what they had, with this idea of an agreement, an international agreement of Petrocaribe. That's what it's called, and that incentive was so powerful, that it overrode us in a lot of different cases. They even lobbied. They used that influence to lobby for it's for increasing our oil prices. I want to say that was during the War on Terror. I think that was during the War on Terror. They lobbied to basically increase oil prices, and this is this idea of how we, Venezuela particularly, I think, was one that stood out above, I would say, the rest, in terms of the idea of a renaissance and what a renaissance could look like, because we are off the rails. We are out of line. We are most certainly a parasite on Earth as a society as it stands now. But it doesn't have to stay that way. And that idea of fighting this and showing that it could be fought, I think is very tremendous. And I think we should look at that even more. Not sure exactly where I heard this, but the idea of particularly intellectuals coming together and essentially throwing sanctioning our government, right? So our own intellectuals sanctioning our own government to different ways and shapes, I think is up for, we need to observe those particular relationships. We need to observe how we can do that. And I think that's a very powerful way to fight back for us in particular as citizens citizens being ruled by this government that could essentially be viewed as a terrorist abroad. Now, do all the YouTube stuff, please. Like this, comment. Give me some information about Venezuela, Petrocaribe, or how these other countries are, fighting back. I think it's really cool. But also about, government secrets. What did you find out through the WikiLeaks? I think this stuff is really interesting and really important for us. And if you're on podcast, please subscribe. Also, don't forget to check out those other episodes that I mentioned. And if anything, I really hope to see you soon. Thank you.